In the world of comic book storytelling, some tales are so massively important they require being told outside of their normal ongoing titles. Whether revolving around a single character, a team of heroes, or encompassing the fate of the universe, these stories are as important as the rest of the books that come out monthly. The following is no exception. Bridging the gap between comics and audio entertainment media, my Big Fat Poll List is proud to present a podcast mini-series.
You've heard of the Avengers, the Justice League, the X-Men, Teen Titans, Guardians of the Galaxy, Defenders, the Legion of Superheroes, even the Watchmen. But what if we told you that there was another team of colorfully clad heroes that you've never heard of who are equally as influential to comic books and the industry as a whole? Who is this mystery team, you ask? Archie Comics' very own stable of masked heroes, the Mighty Crusaders. Join us now for part 2 of our special 5-part miniseries, where we dive into the first revival of the MLJ characters with Mighty Comics, investigate the strange way they both influenced and were influenced by the early Marvel comics, and discover how the Mighty Crusaders were formed in a budding industry with too many superheroes. Welcome back, everyone, to our second episode of our 5-part miniseries on the history of the Mighty Crusaders. I am your host for this special series, Dr. Impact, and joining me today is a newcomer to the My Big Fat Poll List podcast world. Joining me today is Monster Kid. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here and be nice and kind. This is my first time.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
We don't like to give out any ages of anyone that's on the show, but we will say that Monster Kid is a little older than some of the rest of us on the show.
Say what?
Yeah. So now, having said that, we'll get into the meat of this episode here in just a second. But first, this is your first time joining us here on the Poll List and certainly in this miniseries. So just tell us a little bit about what got you into comics and how long you've collected, or are you still collecting?
Well, I am still collecting, not as seriously as I once did, perhaps. There's too much to collect, so I center it more on certain things. But when I was younger, I had a wide interest in many things, not just the comic books, and probably even before the comic books. My older brother and I, who used to go to movies all the time and watch TV shows, and particularly science fiction, fantasy, horror, that was probably my first influence. So naturally, comic books would have to fit right in with that. And we started collecting those at very, very early ages of all kinds and all types. And I probably had a wider variety of interests at that time. Now, being much older and trying to collect just certain things, probably for nostalgic reasons.
Sure.
So I'm more of a jack of all trades, master of none collector who likes certain things. And I have some very weird tastes, things that...
Such as?
Well, like, I don't know if there's anybody that collects the old Gold Key comic books anymore, but I'm really big on that, particularly the Tarzans.
I was saying that's the old Gold Key movie stuff, right?
And the movie and the TV shows. I'll try to get at least one issue of every TV series that ever existed. And that's becoming impossible, but I'm trying to do that. But I also had interest in pulps, even by the whole resurgence of the Doc Savage paperbacks. I got interested in pulps. And then, of course, I wanted to be an artist for a long time. I wanted to be a comic book artist. And then I wanted to be an actor. And then I wanted to be a writer and then a director. And that's why I say jack of all trades, master of none.
Sure.
I tried to do a little bit of all of it. And nowadays, it's more the nostalgic aspect of it. I want to collect the things that I remembered collecting way back then.
Right.
And they're gone. I got rid of them, and now I'm trying to find them again.
I do want to talk about what was your first exposure to these Mighty Crusaders characters. Where did you first learn about them?
Well, now we're going back a few years, actually, and even before the term Mighty Comics, I believe. They were, of course, published by the Archie comic series. We're talking like the first appearance of, like, say, The Fly and the Jaguar. So we're saying 1959, 58, 59, 60. So I was under 10 when I first encountered these superheroes, buying them at my local drugstore, about a block from my home, walking down to the local drugstore and just discovering them on the old-fashioned revolving comic book stands.
Basically, this era that we're about to dive into was the era that you discovered them.
Exactly. Yeah. And at that time, I was always interested in the more colorful superheroes, anything that caught my eye on that revolving stand. And, of course, I bought the DCs and the Marvel comics. And at that time, they weren't even called.
I was going to say, it wasn't even Marvel yet, right?
Yeah. Buying, like, the original Fantastic Four and those at that time. But then on the stand, I would see something very colorful, like The Fly. Here was this guy in this green and yellow superhero costume. So that had to come home with me right away. And the Jaguar was another one who was very, very colorful. I really didn't know who they were. I didn't know anything about them. This was my first encounter with them. And it was a very exciting time. It was like discovering, I thought they were brand new.
You didn't have any older copies from older cousins or older brothers or anything of S.H.I.E.L.D. or
I
Pep?
did not. Now, that does not mean that my older brothers didn't have them. Maybe they had, because I found some of their old comics in my basement. Most of those were mostly of the crime and detective and genre. But they also bought a few of the superhero ones. So they may very well have had many, many of the older MLJ.
Yeah.
At that time. But this, discovering these, was like, it was something totally new. I mean, I knew who Superman and Batman and, of course, the Justice League came along around that same era. But these characters, they weren't part of DC. They were their own breed, and this was, really interesting. I used to regularly buy the Jaguar and Fly, and I'm trying to think of my first encounter with the S.H.I.E.L.D. didn't come until much later, probably, and more in the 63, 64, whenever the Mighty Comics took off.
Right, whenever they kind of had that pseudo relaunch, which we'll get into in more detail here in a minute. So the Fly really, more so even than the Jaguar, the Fly really was probably your first introduction to them.
Yeah, the Fly, and pretty close behind that was the Jaguar.
Yeah.
And of course, at that time, I didn't even know who Jack Kirby was. But there was something about the Fly, that artwork, that captured my eye right away.
That was going to be my next question. Did you get any of I think the first 4 issues, Kirby did. Did you have the Kirby issues of the Fly?
I had some. I know I did. Many of those have gone by the wayside over the years because as I got older, I, centered more on the Marvel comics and just started collecting those. So I would get rid of everything else, sold all the old Dell comics, the 4 colors, and some of these that went by the wayside. Now I wish I would have kept.
I was going to say, it's probably all the stuff that you're now trying to locate.
I am now trying to locate.
Refine,
yes. And I had them at cover price, 10 cents at first and then 12 cents.
Without any further ado, then, because this is the era that you were introduced to them, and you're here to talk with us about these comics as well, let's jump right into it and let's talk about the history of these comics. A mighty history. Monster Kid, much like we did in our previous episode on the MLJ stuff, before really diving into the history of these characters, I do think it's important to lightly touch on where the country was culturally and socially and everything at the time, because I do think that a lot of this Silver Age stuff, not just from these guys, but from DC and Marvel as well, really comes out of what the country was going through, where we were post-war and coming right off of the McCarthyism and all of that stuff.
Right. The Red Scare that was going on. That was so evident in the 1950s. And then, of course, the execution of comic books, you might say, in the 1950s.
Dr. Frederick Wertham and the Seduction of the Innocent.
And all the monster comics and the sci-fi ones were the first to go.
Yeah.
And most of the superheroes disappeared at that time, other than probably the big ones, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman.
And I think it might have been it. I think that it was just the 3 of them that had the staying power.
That was about it.
I'm pretty sure that most of the Justice Society were gone, and MLJ had ended by 1947 or 48,
and Timely,
I think.
was pretty well, had dropped all their superheroes.
From the early era, yeah.
But then by the late 50s, suddenly there was a rebirth. There was a resurgence in superheroes.
Yeah.
That probably started, of course, with DC.
Yeah.
I think. And then with Marvel.
And I think most people, I don't know if you got it when it came out, but I think most people credit the beginning of that Silver Age with Showcase number 4.
The first appearance of Silver Age Flash.
Yeah, Barry Allen Flash, yeah. And that's really kind of where it starts, that idea of taking this old character and almost refurbishing him for a new era, in an era that is also a very optimistic and almost pseudo-innocent time, right after the war was over and now the Korean War had ended, for us anyway. We had left, and and we were going into that atomic age and that nuclear family age, and suburban life was picking up, and all of that kind of combined into this supremely optimistic, hopeful Barry Allen Flash. And it seemed like a lot of the stuff at that time had that kind of slant to it.
Right. And I think a big influence on a lot of that was the resurgence in the science fiction film in that era.
Yeah, like the drive-in stuff.
And, the drive-in flicks and those that were appealing to the teenagers.
Sure.
Get them out of the house, get them away from the TV.
Yeah.
And science fiction, 3D films. A little resurgence in horror, but even the horror in that era was science fiction.
Yeah, it was still giant monsters created by some sort of scientific method.
So the comics picked up on this. There were so many comic books in that era, in the mid to late 50s, that were science fiction oriented, about giant monsters coming up out of the earth or coming from another planet and attacking big cities, because of the success of films like the original Godzilla, Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and so on. So the monster movie, kind of the science fiction monster movie, made way for this comic book era. I mean, even if you look at like something like the Fantastic Four, if you look at its roots, a lot of that comes from the old science fiction films in that era.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
4 people getting together, making their own spaceship, and going up in space. I mean, there are so many movies along those lines in that era that it copied.
That altruistic and optimistic search for improvement and,
a better world out there somewhere.
Yeah.
And then, of course, they all come back as superheroes.
Of course they do, yeah. It's important to know that, because that all heavily influences where comics were going. And The Flash, of course, was not the only one. DC had a lot of success with reviving old characters in that vein. And, of course, they all had more of a scientific slant. Green Lantern had a ring from an alien race as opposed to a magic lantern, and Flash was scientifically created. I mean, they all had much more of a realistic, at that time, origin.
There wasn't a central enemy like in World War II. You had Germany,
you didn't have anything
Hitler, and the Nazis to fight. In the 50s, you had the Red Scare, but then you had science fiction bringing in the mad scientists and the outer space enemy. Yeah. So you had to have heroes that could equal that.
Yeah, the unknown enemy from beyond, DC was not the only ones that jumped on that. Archie Comics jumped in probably even before Marvel did. In 1959, when they reimagined the Shield. They took that same mentality of taking the name of the character but completely doing something new.
A new origin, a new secret identity.
New everything. Yeah, he had a new everything. And that was in The Double Life of Private Strong #1. Now this origin, folks, you'll see some similarities here with another character, which caused a little problem legally for Archie down the line. But a Dr. Malcolm Fleming raises his son, Roger, in a laboratory, essentially, experimenting on his brain and trying to create a superhuman. And when the funding is almost pulled out from under him, essentially, the people are coming down on him, the government is trying to control the thing, he decides he's going to take his son and get him out of there. And, of course, because it's 1959, while they're fleeing, they are attacked by communist spies. And the car is run off the side of the road and down into a ditch. Now, Dr. Fleming dies in this accident, but miraculously, baby Roger lives, to be found later by 2 old farmers from the nearby area who find this baby in this wreckage. I don't remember what the father's name was, but the mother's name was Martha, ironically. And they bring this child home, and he grows up to learn that he has superpowers of flight and strength. Eventually, he and his friend stumble across this old wreckage that I guess had never been cleaned over the 15 years that he's been living with these farmers, who, incidentally, have changed his name. They don't know his name is Roger. Their last name is Strong, and they decide to name him Lancelot. And his name is Lancelot Strong.
Good American name.
A good American name. And something else that becomes a running theme, especially in these early Mighty Comics, I don't know if it played so much in DC, but a lot of borrowing from mythology, a lot of borrowing from classic literary adventure stories. And so, obviously Lancelot coming from the whole King Arthur thing and having ties there with this pseudo-noble sense that follows it. He and his friend discover this wreckage, and of course, look at that. There's a suit, and it's red, white, and blue, and it augments his abilities, and it allows him to harness electricity, and he's fast, and he can fly, and why not put it on? Because that's what you do in a 50s, 60s comic. You just put on the random suit that you find. And he becomes this superhero, and then enlists in the army and becomes a private who is consistently looked down upon by his superiors and his sergeants, and because he's never around, because he's always running off to be the Shield. So obviously, that didn't last too long.
It's interesting that they didn't use the name the Shield in the title of the
I've always wondered why they didn't do that, and I don't know if we'll ever have an answer, or if there is an answer out there and someone knows it, by all means, share it with us. Go to our website at mybigfatpullist.com, or find us on social media, on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and let us know if you have an answer to why they didn't use the Shield name in the title, because they refer to him in the book as the Shield.
And it was owned by that company.
And it was still owned, yeah. Private Strong was created by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. So it's interesting that they would be brought in to create yet another red, white, and blue hero for a different company. It didn't quite take off. They didn't have the Shield name in the title, and DC probably came down on them. There's too many similarities there.
With the Superman series.
With the Superman myth, yeah. The whole finding.
Which is very interesting, because if you take a look at Superman, his origin is almost a direct copy of Doc Savage.
Yeah. Well,
which came 6 years earlier.
And really, if you really want to trace superheroes, superheroes in general really do trace all the way back to Doc Savage. Now, masked crime fighters and masked vigilantes will trace further back.
Even further back.
But superheroes, as we know them, really do start with Doc Savage. So yeah, if Doc Savage beget Superman, and Superman beget S.H.I.E.L.D., and S.H.I.E.L.D. beget Captain America, eventually you follow the line, you get to Private Strong. But
and
these,
of course, Doc Savage's first name is Clark.
And it's Clark, right, exactly. But these similarities, I guess, were a little too much for DC to stomach, and the book only lasted 2 issues before it fell. They didn't publish any more. And incidentally, too, the other thing of note is that these were published by Archie Comics, but they weren't yet called Mighty Comics. On the covers, it still said Archie Adventure Series. But when you look at the inside of the books and you look at the legal print, they are listed as Radio Comics. And they were Radio Comics for a great portion of that early run, even though there was never really a Radio Comics logo on the front. So it looks like it's just an Archie comic, because that's who published Radio Comics. But that's what this was under, was Radio Comics.
And where did that term come from? Do we know?
No, I haven't been able to find anything about that. Some people believe that it might have been an extension in some way of the Black Hood radio show, that they pulled it from there because they had a show that was on the radio for a very short time in the 40s. I don't know if that's accurate or not, and I haven't been able to find anything. Again, another question that for our audience, if you guys know where the term Radio Comics for this run came from. Now, we're not talking about the Radio Comics that came in the 90s and recently. That's a very different thing, and it's spelled with an X instead of an S at the end. But these original Radio Comics, if you have an idea of where that came from, let us know. Yeah, Double Life of Private Strong kicked it off, but it only lasted for 2 issues. However, in that first issue of Double Life of Private Strong was an advertisement for an upcoming book that would completely change Archie's publishing forever. And that was The Adventures of the Fly, #1, by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby.
Yeah.
And you said that that's where you discovered these characters, was from that book.
Yes.
Which is a great book if you ever get a chance. Anybody gets a chance to read it. It's really fun and kind of riffs on the Captain Marvel Shazam idea, where it's a young boy, Tommy Troy, who is an orphan and is adopted by a mysterious wizardly couple, the Marches. And they're a little, at first, they're a little overbearing and a little unlikable. And they, almost like Miss Hannigan from Annie of sorts, you know.
A little Charles Dickens.
Little Charles Dickens even, yeah. There was very, very much undertones of that, yeah. And one night he is sent up to the attic to clean the attic at the Marches' home, and lo and behold, there's this crazy ring stuck in a spider web that has a shape of a fly on it. And when he touches it, it opens a magic portal, and out steps Tehran of the Fly People. I assume that's how you pronounce it. Tehran. I don't know. This kind of little bug-eyed looking Yoda-like creature. And he explains that his people used to, at one time, dominate the world. And through their greed, they eventually started to destroy their civilization, and half of their civilization fled to their new fly world where they live, and the other half stayed behind and morphed and mutated into what is now known as the common housefly. And, and these people, the ones that got away and survived, they all have giant bug eyes, and they've got the weird wings, and they're long and thin and lanky and, very strange, almost monstrous and alien looking.
So we didn't evolve from apes. We evolved
from flies, apparently,
right.
yeah.
Right.
And they've been waiting for someone pure that they could give their powers to be a champion for justice. Because in 1959, when this debuted, that's all the origin you needed. You didn't need anything else. In the 40s, everybody was a cop or a scientist or, a reporter who either had to scoop a story or someone else died and they had to get revenge. In the 50s and the 60s, before Marvel came along, you just had to be pure of heart and be given magic by an alien race or something to be a hero, and that's all you needed. That was the whole origin.
And it took maybe 2 pages to tell the origin.
Yeah, get it over with and get going. Get into the action.
Get him in his costume and get the action going.
Yep. And that's really what a lot of these early books for Radio Comics, Mighty Comics at that time were. There's really not a lot in developing characterization. There's really not a lot in developing story. It's really more about what kind of crazy action can we do. And quite often, in the Fly book specifically, it's alien invaders. Almost every issue. And every issue has about 3 or 4 stories, in complete stories. Unlike today, where it takes 3 or 4 issues to tell one complete story. Then you would get 3 or 4 complete stories in one issue.
Took 5 to 6 pages.
Yeah.
If you had a 10-page story, that was an epic.
That was a big deal. And the other thing that the book also did was that it created what they called the widescreen angle. And basically it was like a double-page spread. It would go across the whole top. Or, in some of the early issues, you would turn the comic sideways. Yeah. Now, that became a regular staple for a lot of fans in the 90s, especially with Image Comics and those creators, the Rob Liefelds and Jim Lees and those guys would do that kind of stuff all the time. But it really kind of started here with Adventures of the Fly #1 and, of course, Jack Kirby. And those first 4 issues, that's classic Kirby art. It's beautiful art to look at.
Yes. Particularly his minor characters.
Yeah.
The street life people.
Yeah.
The people that Kirby knew in the neighborhood he grew up in.
The people that he grew up with, very much so, yeah.
And that's a staple of Kirby's art.
Yeah.
Little men with bald heads and ugly faces and buck teeth.
Or like Mr. March, giant beards. He must have known a lot of guys with big beards, because if you look at his work, there are always guys with giant beards in his stuff. Here he is, he's getting, this ring and turning into an adult superhero, but that only lasts for 4 issues. After 4 issues, Kirby leaves the book. And I want to say Joe Simon, too. I think they both left the book after issue 4.
Yeah.
And with issue 5, and I don't believe there's any explanation. It's one of the few issues that I'm missing, so I've never actually read issue 5. So I don't know if there's an explanation for it, but in issue 5, he's an adult. Mm-hmm. And they say that it has been about 9 years since issue 4. They do address that from what I understand. And he is an adult, and he is now a lawyer. Thomas Troy, the lawyer. Now, I didn't know you could become a lawyer in 9 years, but evidently in the world of The Fly,
he was very bright.
He was very smart, yeah. So starting with issue 5 on, he's an adult who just turns into the Fly when he says the magic words, "I wish to be the Fly." And it changes the whole book. And this is, again, before Matt Murdock. I don't know. This might even be the first lawyer hero. I would have to do a little bit more research on that. But
right. Lawyer superhero.
Yeah, lawyer superhero
because
with powers.
There were people like Mr. District Attorney back in the 40s.
Yeah, but that's a little different. They weren't
were just ordinary crime-fighting lawyers.
Yeah, they weren't masked heroes of any kind, yeah. By the time issue 7 hits of The Adventures of the Fly, they finally bring back one of the classic Golden Age heroes. And this is not a reimagining like they did with the Shield. This isn't a refurbishing like DC was doing. The Black Hood makes his Silver Age appearance. In the book, he does not really explain where he's been. He doesn't say what he's been doing. But he teams up with the Fly, and immediately they both share their secret identities with one another. Because, well, if you're a superhero and I'm a superhero, then we're buddies. So this is who I am. As is the case for a book from that time. So this is July of 1960. So technically, we still haven't even gotten the Fantastic Four yet.
Right.
DC is moving quite along, and the Justice League have premiered by this point, so they still have a plethora of superheroes, more than Radio Comics guys do. But the Black Hood has now appeared, and I want to say that the issue before that or the issue after that, the Fly even teamed up with Lancelot Strong. So they have started now connecting as well by this point.
Now, the Black Hood, the original, dates back to 1940?
Yes, October of 1940 in Top Notch number 9. He premieres. And he was one of the big staples of that time. And like the rest, vanished when superhero comics went away at the end of the 40s. But yeah, he comes back, and he's in his yellow outfit from before. The bizarre thing is that the gloves, his boots, and his trunks, because superheroes had trunks, everybody did back then, are red. So he still has the yellow tunic, he still has the yellow tights, he still has the black hood, but the rest of it is red. And only for that issue, as far as I'm aware. And I don't know if the colorists just didn't get the memo or if they were trying something different, but when I read that for the first time, that was a little off-putting as someone who's a fan of the Black Hood. I was like, why in the world is he wearing red gloves? That makes no sense.
Well, red was a popular color for superheroes.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, especially probably because of the Flash, I would guess, because of the success there. And that color then eventually made its way to Archie and the Radio Comics with the Jaguar. In September of 1961, they debut The Adventures of the Jaguar #1. And the Jaguar was Ralph Hardy, who was an archaeologist and a zoologist in Peru, who was attacked or happened to be there, I can't remember which, by a giant serpent of some sort, like a dinosaur-looking creature almost. He flees the monster and runs into a cave where he discovers the belt with this actually, it looks like a leopard print. It doesn't look like it's Jaguar print. It looks like it's a leopard print belt with a Jaguar buckle. And when he puts it on and says the magic words, the Jaguar, wasn't very difficult to come up with.
Did the Fly people leave this laying around too?
They must have. Yeah, I don't know. I think later, when the characters were relaunched again in the 80s, I think they did try to go back and make some sense of that. But we'll get to that in a future episode. As of right now, this was just a magic belt that he put on, and he becomes the Jaguar. And unlike the Fly, who was a boy and turns into an adult, or Thomas Troy, who becomes the Fly and wears the face mask and the goggles, the Jaguar followed more along the Superman route. When he was Ralph Hardy, he had slick black hair and a pencil-thin mustache. And when he became the Jaguar, his hair was a little more stylized, and the pencil mustache was gone. And that was the change. But I guess if you could believe that nobody found out Clark Kent was Superman, I guess they figured they'll buy into the difference in the Jaguar.
It was a very naive time.
It was, yeah. But, it's also fun, too, because I personally enjoy that kind of stuff, especially in that era. I don't want to necessarily see that kind of cheesiness in a modern comic, but I love it in that era because it's part of the time, and that's part of the approach that the creators were taking with things, and I think it's very important for that era. So I love that kind of approach. So the Jaguar eventually started to connect with the Fly without having met the Fly. So they really started to try and build a cohesive universe without getting too bogged down in continuity. There wasn't a lot of continuity back then. That wasn't something that came heavily until Stan Lee, really. With the Adventures of Jaguar number 5, Catgirl Arrives. Now, Catgirl had premiered earlier in The Fly, and I don't know if you had ever read that particular issue, her first appearance in there.
I think I even had it at one time.
Yeah.
But I don't remember.
She was, I don't know if she was reincarnated or immortal, I can't remember which, but she basically was originally the model for the Sphinx in ancient Egypt. She can communicate with all forms of feline life of any kind. And she, of course, runs into the Fly, and then, that was a one-off, a one-issue story. But she shows up again here in Jaguar and becomes a recurring character.
Makes sense.
Which makes sense, yeah.
Bring the felines together.
Yeah, right. And she starts off as his villain, as a foil for him, but he eventually saves her life in an issue, and I forgive me, I don't recall the issue number, but he saves her life, and she becomes obsessed with him. And for much of the rest of the series, whenever she would show up, she would orchestrate things in the hopes of the Jaguar falling madly in love with her, because she felt like they were destined to be together and that he should never waste his time with his secretary. Oh, I can't even remember her name, Jill or Jane or Ross, I think, or something to that effect. But she was basically...
It wasn't Dolly who was his girlfriend when...
that was the Fly. Girl. The Fly's girlfriend when he was a young boy was Dolly.
It was Dolly.
Yeah. No, this was not Dolly. This was, I can't remember her name, but she was drawn very much like Lois Lane at the time. Mm-hmm. And also, ironically, the Jaguar had another character that would show up, and I want to say her name was Kree Null, I think, and she was a serpent woman, very much like Superman had. Mm-hmm. Superman had Lois Lane vying for his attention and had Lana Lang in Smallville vying for him.
Well, did DC complain about any of this? Particularly
evidently,
Catgirl?
Yeah, right. Over Catwoman, yeah. Who was a villain, but who becomes...
was obsessed with
the... Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't know. Hmm. I have not seen anything. I guess they only had issue with Private Strong because he was a hero, because it was a man, maybe. Maybe they didn't care. I don't know. It was around this time, too, actually, I think the same month as the first issue of the Jaguar, in fact, where The Adventures of the Fly, number 14, gives the Crusaders universe its first full-fledged, well-received female hero. They had a couple back in the MLJ era. I think Madame Satan was a anti-hero that rode the line, and a few characters like that, but nobody of really any kind of major note until Kim Brand. And Kim Brand actually premieres in the previous issue, in issue 13. She's saved by the Fly, and they become friends. And she was an actress, a Hollywood actress, which is an interesting take, kind of a Wonder Man thing before Wonder Man came around. And the Fly gets kidnapped. And so Tehran returns and gives her a Fly ring, just the same. She's sent off as Fly Girl to protect him and help him. And they become a team. She's almost, I don't want to say sidekick, she's not quite Robin. It's more of a partnership between the two.
Right. Did this predate Hawkman and Hawkgirl?
I don't believe so. I think both Hawkman and... Well, I know Hawkman goes back to the 40s. I want to say Shiera goes back to the 40s as well.
I thought so.
So yeah, I don't think they have that designation going for them. But what I do find interesting about Fly Girl and Fly at this time is it seemed as if every adventure they went on, and almost every time it was an alien, every alien they encountered, whatever superpower they needed to defeat them, the writers gave them in that moment. Every issue, they seemed to rack up new superpowers all the time. I think initially they just had the buzz guns, which would freeze people in place and temporarily paralyze them. And then eventually their wings could create windstorms, I think, right?
Right.
But then they started spinning cocoons made of steel around them to protect themselves, and they could glow bright as a firefly bug, and they could burrow as hard as a termite, and I'm not sure why they were the fly if they could harness all the insects, or why weren't they just some sort of insect?
Well, there were a lot more superheroes popping up and with greater powers, so they had to keep up.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, to kind of topple them. But it's fun to watch. Eventually, they started getting telepathy even, and they would communicate with the insect world,
do
and
that all the time.
Yeah, they do. Of course, they do, and they would communicate with each other telepathically. By 1962, Marvel had come around, and things were starting to change. And Stan Lee was bringing in the Marvel way of telling stories. Characters were real, or as realistic as we had seen at that point. People had real-life issues, real-life problems, and they connected more, and there was more cohesion to the storytelling.
And the secret identity started to fade away for some.
For some, it didn't become as important. And, of course, this is going to influence other books, and it did affect the Archie stuff as well. They started having personal problems, too, although they weren't as well crafted.
No.
It was things like Kim Brand, struggling with the fact that she had to shoot a scene for the movie, but she's also a fly girl, and I don't know how to balance this life. Well, I guess that's one way of taking what Stan was doing and working it. But
movie stars have that problem.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, first world issues. But what they did do that was very interesting was in issue 21 of Adventures of the Fly, a number of the Fly's enemies gathered. And this was a time when, outside of DC, villains didn't reappear. Other than Catgirl, really, there weren't any recurring villains. Certainly not for these characters. It was always just another space monster or a criminal or something. Well, in issue 21, the Spider, who was a recurring villain for the Fly, and who by this point was no longer dressed as a supervillain, he almost wore gray prison robes, and he was a short little bald fat man, basically, who looked an awful lot like Lex Luthor at the time. He gets broken out of prison by, I think his name was Brocker or something, BRAK-R or something to that effect. Anyway, he was an alien villain of the Fly's from a previous issue. This group of villains formed together to form the Anti-Fly League and go after the Fly and Fly Girl.
That was the best name they could come up with.
That was what they came up with, the Anti-Fly League, yeah. So, obviously the cheesiness was certainly there, and we hadn't quite gotten to the Adam West Batman show, but camp was starting to seep into other comics outside of Marvel, and it was starting to affect all of them. 1963 hits, November of 1963, with issue 15, the Jaguar is canceled.
Yes.
And the Jaguar ends. And that at this point, the Catgirl had even decided that she was going to try to become a hero to win over Jaguar, and was almost like his Fly Girl. But we unfortunately only got, I think, 2 issues of that before it ended, and we weren't able to go any further. And in May of 1964, The Adventures of the Fly number 30 hits. And other than being the end of the initial Radio Comics run, this is significant because it introduces a new hero. They went back to the idea of taking an old hero and refurbishing them. And they bring us the Comet. And now the Comet, who is in a red and white suit with a red and white helmet, comes from the planet Altrox. He's the king of the planet Altrox, and he has come to Earth because he's been watching Fly Girl and he intends to marry her. And they fly around together, and they argue about whether or not she should go with him, and eventually he gets sick of her back and forth, and he's like, forget it, I'm going back home, and I'll marry an Altroxian woman. And he leaves, and that's it. That's the end of the Radio Comics run. But with the success of Marvel Comics, and with the success of Justice League at DC, and the Avengers, and at this point, the X-Men, too, were hitting, and they came back. About, I want to say almost about a year later, they returned with Flyman number 31. He's now changed to Flyman.
Mm-hmm.
And I think his powers change, too, at that point, because now he can grow and shrink.
Right. But he's still the lawyer. Right?
He's still the lawyer.
Thomas Troy.
Yeah, he's still Thomas Troy. And in Flyman 31, we have the Black Hood returning. The Comet returns, only now he's still in the same uniform, but instead of it being red and yellow, now it's like green and brown and orange or something. And
rainbow.
And there's a rainbow helmet.
Yeah.
And it's, I don't know what they were thinking with the colors of that. But it is the Altroxian King alien guy from issue 30 who has returned to Earth, and the shield, only it's not Lancelot Strong. This is the shield that looks like the original shield.
Right.
The four of them, with the Flyman, that being the fourth, the four of them unite because the Spider is up to his old tricks again. And they go to take on the Spider. And basically, this is the first appearance of the Mighty Crusaders.
Right.
This is the first roster. Flyman, Shield, Comet, and Black Hood. Although they're not officially formed by the end of the issue. They're taking the bickering Marvel Comics thing to an extreme at this point. I don't know how long it's been since you've read those first early appearances of the Mighty Crusaders, but having just read them recently for this, it was very funny that they just immediately start in on each other.
Start in, yeah. The egos leap out at you.
It was like they knew.
We're going to show you these are real people too. But, oh, who wants to work with these?
Who wants to work with these guys? Yeah. It was like they knew that, the Avengers will bicker and the FF will bicker, but the charm that was there was not with these guys. They went at each other's throats for no reason.
I do recall all that, yes.
And it was very funny. And also suddenly, randomly, and I don't know why, now the Black Hood, who has gone back to just black and yellow, the red color is gone. He's now wearing a cape and riding a mechanical horse named Nightmare.
Yes. Instead of his motorcycle.
Instead of the motorcycle, for some reason. Yeah, I don't know who thought that was a good idea, but for the first three issues that Flyman had returned, and Flygirl was still around as well, it was essentially team-ups. It was essentially these three books were the formation of the team, and they hadn't settled on what they were going to call themselves. And I want to say in issue, I don't remember if it's issue 31, at the end of issue 31, or if it's in issue 32, the Spider lures them all under the pretenses of a group called the Mighty Crusaders forming. And when they get there, they discover that it's the Spider, and he set a trap for them. And when they defeat him, they think, well, maybe that's not a bad idea. Maybe we should do that. But they immediately start in arguing again about what they're going to call it, and it's amazing. By issue 33 of Flyman, they bring two old characters from the MLJ years back, only now as villains. The Hangman has returned, who has gone bad, and the Wizard has returned, who is now an older man, who actually looks like Mr. March from the early Fly books, really, with a turban-like thing on his head. It's like pointy turban almost. And they're villains, and they've teamed up, and that really kind of brings the Crusaders together and solidifies them. Now, I don't know if it was ever really fully explained what happened to the Hangman, why he suddenly flipped, but for a predominant amount of time, he was a villain in this time.
Well, he had a name that sounded more villainous.
Yeah, he did.
So that's why they went with that. And the Wizard, too, because usually wizards are villains in most
especially in books at that time.
Fantasy books. Right?
Yeah.
Now, I know, unlike Marvel at that time, who gave credit to writers, artists, inkers, letterers, they were not doing that. So do we have any idea who wrote or drew those early issues? I want to say the art might have been, was it George Tuska? But I don't know who the writers at all were at that time, because that art in the Crusaders lasted for quite some time, and he also, whoever that was, also drew, I think, that short series of The Shadow that Archie put out, who became a superhero, not the Shadow from the pulps. His art was very similar to, and I don't know how to pronounce his name, Mike Sikowski, who used to draw Justice League. No credit anywhere.
No, I don't know the answer to that. Yet again, another question for our fans out there to clarify for us and go to our website or to our social media and give us the answer if you know the artists of those early books. Because you're right, the Archie stuff did not credit people.
No.
And the
Very
DC
few
stuff
did.
very rarely credited. Yeah, Marvel was the one that started that.
Right.
Now
and then DC jumped on it.
And then they jumped in on it. Now I do know that later on in the Mighty Comics run, they did start crediting.
Right. When they became more and more like Marvel.
Yes, when they became more and more like Marvel and started using the Mighty Comics logo,
which was very similar to the
Marvel Comics logo. At that point, they had an artist by the name of Paul Reinman who was working with them.
Might have been him.
Much like how Stanley Lieber was now Stan Lee.
Yeah.
He was listed as Paul R. A-R-E.
Oh.
Yeah. And Jerry Siegel, by this point, was working there. Oh, okay. And he was listed as Jerry S. E-S-S. Now, I have read that some people think that that's because they were making fun of Stan Lee.
Yeah.
And some people think that the whole thing after the Flyman relaunch was lampooning Marvel. And some people think that it was trying to copy Marvel and doing it poorly. I don't want to think that they were lampooning. Maybe they were. Mm-hmm. I like to think that they were trying to achieve Marvel and just didn't quite do it.
Yeah.
But it worked well enough that the Mighty Crusaders got their own book in November of 1965. And it was at that point that they introduced who would become their primary nemesis, the Brain Emperor.
Oh, yes.
He was kind of the guy, and again, we'll get to this in future episodes, but he's kind of the guy that comes back over and over again in some form. He's their Dr. Doom, if you will. But they also started doing things about retconning the history, where DC at that point was starting to say that anything prior to Showcase number 4 took place on a different world. They weren't doing that. They were retconning. And it was at that point that they said that this new shield that was running around was actually the son of the original Joe Higgins shield. And that the original Joe Higgins shield was turned to stone at the end of the 40s by a villain known as the Eraser. Now, why you're called the Eraser and you turn people to stone, I don't understand the correlation, but that's that's what they called him. And now his son, Bill Higgins, was the new shield. And he's the shield pretty much throughout the Mighty Comics run. I think that
But he looks just like
him. He looks just like him.
Right.
Exactly like him. The red hair and the same exact suit that Joe later switched to with the blue trunks. And I think it was at that time, too, where they started to retcon the Comet. And I don't think that they necessarily were connecting him just yet to the original Comet, but I think they started saying at this point that he was not from the planet Altrox, that he was human. So I don't think that they had quite said he was the original John Dickering, at least not in anything that I have seen, but that was certainly coming in future relaunches. Now, the Mighty Comics thing hit the top when Mighty Crusaders number 4 came out. That was the pinnacle. It's the most famous Mighty Crusaders comic of all time, I think. I think most people would agree. And it was titled Too Many Superheroes. It was almost like they didn't want to take the time that Stan Lee had done in introducing people. They didn't want to take the time that Julius Schwartz was doing over at DC and introduce people. They just knew they had to get a lot of characters out there. And catch up fast. So in this one book, get ready, they bring back Steel Sterling, The Web, Blackjack, Mr. Justice, The Fox, Inferno, Captain Flag, Firefly, Bob Phantom, Fireball, Jaguar, Zambini, Kardak, Dusty, Roy, the Superboy, and 2 different versions of the Wizard, as well as the evil Hangman. They all are in the one issue, plus your regular cast of Mighty Crusaders.
Some of those probably should never have been brought back.
Probably, yeah, at least not in the way that they did, yeah. It's interesting. I recently reread that issue, too, because it's so much fun. By this point, these heroes are coming out of retirement because they think the idea of the Mighty Crusaders is fun and cool, and they want to be a part of the team. But when they go to meet with them, what are they doing? They're arguing about nothing. And it was, I think, an argument that was started by the Shield giving a backhanded comment to the Black Hood or something. And then all these heroes show up, and they're all like, oh, we can be better than you guys. And then they all start arguing. And it almost becomes a free-for-all. And the Wizard and the Hangman attack. And they can't defeat him. They can't stop him. I could be wrong, but if I remember correctly, I think it was Mr. Justice who somehow pulls the Wizard and Roy the Superboy and Dusty, I think, from the past, from the 40s, and brings them to now so that the Wizard can talk some sense into his future self and stop it. And he succeeds. And then they go back. Now, why didn't the Wizard, when he went back, if he knows he's going to go evil, why didn't he stop himself? Why didn't he just change the history? Yeah. I guess they weren't thinking about that. But and eventually everybody leaves and nobody joins the team. But it's a very fun issue, and if any of you can get your hands on it or check it out, if you like books that have a lot of superheroes, this was almost Mighty Comics' way of saying, okay, DC, you do your JLA, JSA crossovers, we're going to double down and give you everybody in one book. And it doesn't work, but it's fun. By September of 1966, Flyman ends with issue 39. And I want to say sometime earlier that summer, The Mighty Crusaders ends with issue 7. It only lasted 7 issues. And Flyman becomes Mighty Comics Presents, starting with issue 40, which is basically just an anthology book. Mm-hmm. It's like a showcase book.
This way they can use all the heroes and
at any time.
All titles.
Yep.
Printed all in one.
In
monthly,
one book,
bi-monthly.
Yep. However they hit their deadlines. Yep. And they don't have to worry about their continuity. They can just tell stories. They don't have to try to keep up with Marvel and DC. And of course, that doesn't quite work out either. And by September of 1967, Mighty Comics number 50 comes out. And that's it. And that's the end of the Mighty Comics era. And the characters go back into the vault, as it were. And that's where we ask you, were you a fan of the initial revival era of the MLJ characters? And if so, what characters were you most impressed with? Go to our website at mybigfatpolllist.com, fill out the contact form, and fill us in on all the details. A mighty influence. So we've gone through the history, we've kind of talked about all that, and probably a little bit more detail than we even really needed to, but it's fun to talk about this stuff. The biggest things to take away from this is, and I'm sure some of our listeners have picked up on it already, the influence that some of this had on books at the time, namely The Fly being the biggest one. Right. It's pretty obvious that Spider-Man was a direct link to The Fly.
Maybe my history is off, but wasn't The Fly, the original idea was to make him a spider?
It was. Initially, if we actually go back even further to prior to Double Life of Private Strong coming out, if we go back to 1954, Joe Simon had actually pitched an idea to Harvey Comics about a young boy named Tommy Troy who becomes a superhero known as the Spider-Man, no hyphen, it's just straight through, by rubbing a magic ring. So this is 54. This is way before. He looked similar to the Fly. He had the goggles, and he had a very similar-like costume, only it was red and blue. And I want to say that at that point, Jack Kirby was attached to it.
I believe he created the look.
I believe he did. Now, I know that Kirby was attached to it when they later revamped the character and tried to sell the character as the Silver Spider.
Right.
Because the character kind of molded to that. By the time they got to Archie and they had picked up the idea, I've heard that it was Jack who decided he didn't want to draw a spider character. I don't know if that's true or not, but basically by the time they had gotten there, they changed it to the Fly. And when Jack had gone to Marvel and they were looking for a new character, he, as legend goes, suggested to Stan, well, we do have that character, the Spider-Man, that we could maybe try to do something with. Not the story that Stan tells.
Right.
Of seeing a spider on the wall and going, oh, there we go.
Yeah, I got a great idea.
In fact, I think Steve Ditko even confirms Jack's story in an interview at one point. He confirmed that was what happened. So that's kind of the biggest influence. But, the other influence in The Fly that I don't think many people think about or talk about is this was, I want to say, 2 or 3 months before the debut of Green Lantern, Hal Jordan Green Lantern, who is an Earthling who is given a magic ring by an alien race and given powers to be a protector.
Right.
Whether or not that copied The Fly or it was a coincidence, I don't know. I guess that's debatable. The Fly is surprisingly influential at this time in comics. He's not the only one. Characters in his book were firsts. We were talking about the Anti-Fly League before. I mean, a few months prior to the Anti-Fly League appearing, I think Superman went up against the Superman Revenge Squad.
Oh, right.
But that was a team that started out as a team. They weren't individual characters that were brought together, like the Masters of Evil were, or like the Injustice League, or like the Secret Six, or the Sinister Six. Yeah, that's what I meant, Sinister Six. All of those ideas came after the Anti-Fly League. The Anti-Fly League initiated the supervillain team-up, essentially, in that sense, in creating a team. And it is a little surprising that the character doesn't get a whole lot of attention for some of these facts. The other thing that the Fly book did before anyone else was bring back original characters from the 40s. When issue 7 came out and the Black Hood emerged in his red and yellow and black outfit, that beat Flash of Two Worlds, the famous introduction of the multiverse, by, I want to say, almost a year. Which, of course, brought back the Golden Age Flash. But this really was the first time a Golden Age character was brought back, and it predated Captain America returning by years. And Submariner as well, because I think that was, FF3, I think?
Yeah, and of course the Human Torch.
And the Human Torch was a different...
62? Is that the first issue of Fantastic?
61 or 62. Or 61, I think it's 61.
November 61,
yeah.
I believe. Yeah.
That book really kind of influenced a number of major things in comics. Outside of that, it was more how much they were being influenced by others. There wasn't a whole lot that they started. Certainly not as many benchmarks as they had in the 40s with the original stuff. One piece of information I did just discover is that in an early issue of The Fly, there was a panel drawn by a young unknown artist by the name of Neil Adams, who had, I think at 17, had submitted art to Archie of various different strips and various different things. And one of the things that he submitted was a drawing of Tommy turning into the Fly. I don't recall what issue it was, but whatever artist they had draw the panel, they didn't like it. And so they replaced it with his art, but he didn't know until he had gone to follow up.
Oh.
And I think he was probably 18 or 19 by this point. But Neil Adams, the great Neil Adams, essentially got his start working for Archie, for these characters on The Fly. I mean, Jack Kirby, Jerry Siegel, Neil Adams. I mean, these are some, Joe Simon, these are some big names.
I think Frank Frazetta also did some drawings.
I'm sure he did. He was a stable, artist at a lot of the companies at that time. I'm sure he did. It's amazing to me, the connection and, sorry for the bad pun, but the impact that these characters have on the industry still today, sure, but especially at that time, that no one seems to fully know, and probably because they've never quite caught on.
Right.
So now with that other stuff, with the relaunch, and after they started to be influenced more by Marvel, by trying to infuse real life issues and real life problems. I mean, the Web was a henpecked hero, and they actually called him that, the henpecked hero. Now, with all of that, while you were reading Marvel comics, had you stuck with them? Because you had started with them, you said, but did you stick with them when Marvel influenced?
I believe I oh boy, this is a long time ago. I believe I did, though, because I was starving for comic books. And read most of the DCs, all the Marvels. A new one came along, and boy, Mighty Crusaders, yeah, I bought them. I read them, yeah, I kept them. But I can even remember at that age thinking, these are some neat heroes, but they're not doing as good a job as Marvel. You know, and I did that with other companies, too. I mean, the Gold Key superheroes and the occasional Dell superheroes and a few other Tower Comics and these others that were creating superheroes. I bought them all. But they were all like second stringers compared to, it was like nobody could compete with what was going on at Marvel or DC.
Retrospective review of the Mighty Comics line. Well, like we did on our previous episode, we'll do a real quick retrospective review, which we've already kind of touched on a little bit. But basically, we'd like to answer for people, where can you read these books? Where can you find these books? How attainable are they? Unlike the early MLJ stuff, there's probably not a lot of scans that you can find online of these books. Or if you do, they're probably not legal scans. You will probably have to try to hunt down the issues. There's a couple of trades. There's the Mighty Crusaders collection, which collects Flyman 31, 32, and 33, and Mighty Crusaders #1. And then there's the Fly collection, which collects the first 4 issues of the Fly, the Kirby issues. Outside of that, there are a few issues of the Red Circle Blue Ribbon comics that are reprints of this era in the 80s. They reprinted some of this stuff. But otherwise, you would pretty much have to try and track down the actual books themselves.
So there haven't been any new incarnations since...
Of reprints of this stuff? Yeah, nothing recent of reprinting on these things. Now, finding them can be a little difficult, checking online and checking comic shops. When you do, they're not that terribly priced. I don't know how many you're missing, but I'm not missing very many, and I've been able to pay $5 to $10 a book for most of them.
Except for like first appearances, issues, those jump way up.
Yeah, except for the first ones. Those double Life of Private Strongs are tough. The first Fly, those first 4 Flies are pretty tough.
And I think the first Jaguar too.
The first Jaguar can be a little pricey. I think it's still under $50 if you find it. Probably not in a 9.0 grade or anything, but you can probably find a pretty decent copy for under $50. Surprisingly, that first appearance of the Mighty Crusaders is not much. You would think that would be more. Unfortunately, you would have to track down the books. Now, as far as is it worth it, I personally think it's worth it. I think it's worth every penny.
You have to be a fan.
You have to be a fan, though. Yeah,
right.
You gotta know what you're getting into with the books because, as we said, that the quality does dip after the Mighty Crusaders book gets going. Unfortunately, but boy, those early ones are great, especially those early Flies. And I don't mean just the first 4. I mean probably the first 20 to 25 issues of the Fly are so fun. Especially if you love late 50s, early 60s style of adventure comics.
The short story, get to the point, wrap it up.
Yep.
The next story has nothing to do with it.
Nothing to do with it. It's just another adventure.
Which is the way series television was back then.
Yeah. It was easier to ingest, bite-sized pieces. You didn't feel like you missed something if you missed part of it. I say yes, it holds up. I say go out and get them. Just be aware that maybe the last 10 or 12 issues of the Mighty Comics run might dip a little bit, but I say it's worth it. Well, that's it. That is our second episode. That is our episode on the Mighty Comics series. Thank you, Monster Kid, for coming and joining us.
Thank you, Doctor.
And being a part of this and talking to us about this era of the Mighty Crusaders. And thank you all for joining us for our second round. And we want you all to come back and experience part 3 with us in the next episode, where we will cover the Red Circle comics line, and we will witness how these special characters helped inspire one of the most iconic and, I personally believe, greatest stories in comic book history. So until our next crusade, stay mighty, friends.
We have reached the end of this verbal adventure, but there will be more. Be sure to bag and board the knowledge you have been given in the long boxes of your mind, safe from the dust bunnies of memory. Visit mybigfatpolllist.com for all of their 4-color content and follow their social media pages to stay informed. And remember, the secrets of the universe are between the panels.
I don't remember what the father's name was, but, the mother's name was Martha, ironically.
Why'd you say that name?
Why did you say that name?